Hello everyone. Welcome to the afternoon session, the first talk. We've got another great talk, I've heard, well that's what he's told me, okay, by Colby from Octopus Deploy. Colby's actually ex-AusCERT a while ago as well, and today Colby is talking about how to build some honeypot goodness, how to build a fake company for threat intelligence. So please welcome Colby.
All right, I'll make sure the clicky clicks. We've got two clickers, so I might be dual wielding. This way? Cool. So I'm talking about making a fake business, messing around. A lot of stuff where I come from, I used to work at AusCERT. I mess around with honeypots a lot in my spare time. It's always been something that I've really enjoyed, but you always struggle to get like a lot of leadership and stuff like that out of honeypots. Not a lot of people want to say, here's exactly what I'm doing and all of the information, because then they burn all of the information for people to know about. And it's something I've been wanting to do for quite a long time, to try to run a whole like fake business and see like how far down the rabbit hole could you go with trying to run like a more complex honeypot environment as opposed to opening a single port on a single server. And one of the big things which really kicked me over the edge to say, I'm going to push this into a talk, was like the great reckoning of Log4j, which I'm sure a lot of people have had to deal with. Friday, finish lunch, chilling out, see like some blog post and some edgy tweet, and then you're like, oh, that's not that bad. We're not really running Java, right? And even though you're not running Java, you still jump in, you check all the logs, and you're like, oh my God, it's everywhere, and it's everywhere yesterday. And a big thing about, the company I work for currently, Octopus Deploy, we're a continuous deployment product. And so we have a bunch of marketing people. They love to jump out there and say, here's how our product integrates with Jenkins, here's how it integrates with TeamCity, all this stuff. So we have these things out there public on the internet so that people can see how it all works. So granted, it's not the worst case scenario, but everyone has some Java somewhere. And then there's also the little bit of Java you don't know about, because it's always there. So my big thing was focusing on TeamCity. It's in Java. They can't hide that from me. So essentially, on the day, you have to go like, you hacked, mate? And they're like, nah, bruvs, probably not. And I get it. It's like really complicated. You're a big product, and it can be handled in so many different ways. And the version you're running is like a few versions behind, so it's so old that you're safe, you think. But no one can tell this stuff immediately. And basically going, what do you mean prob's not? Like, this stuff started happening yesterday. We need an answer straight away. We can't just wait for you to, mess around and do all your disclosure and stuff. We need to find out if we're compromised right now. So basically, I set myself a goal of, I want to know what is affected before anyone else. And it's an ambitious goal, so I essentially set myself some scope. So I set two different rules. So the first one was, I called it an experiment right from the start. So it means coming in with like a thesis and a deadline. This is something where it is a rabbit hole and you can just keep going down forever. This is maths. Normies know it as Married at First Sight. And they always go out of their way to call it an experiment. It's not just, stupid TV show. It's an experiment. And the second thing I set was, in the middle of an incident, I don't word good advisories. And Kyle knows this firsthand. During Log4j, we have public integrations with TeamCity. So it was very much not impacted, but we were running those Log4j versions. So we had to push out an advisory. And anyone that was dealing with Log4j, you had to deal with, for Log4j, the first time and the second time they fixed it and the third time they fixed it, and I don't remember how many times they fixed it in the end. So I wanted something where potentially I could get use out of this thing if I pick something that, say, is my crown jewels, like a TeamCity server, which I know is for so many people, and if it's not that, it's a Ansible tower or Jenkins server or something like that, or for some people, our product. I wanted to be able to like get some information out of it, but while I'm in this like half-baked state, because you always are during an incident. So the whole thing about crown jewels, the idea of setting up a very complex honeypot is a lot of work. And it is down to that whole thing of there's only so much you can do. You can send yourself crazy running up like a whole business, and then you have to start doing disclosures for that business in response to that business. But essentially really narrowing the scope and going, what's one thing that is really critical to your business, be it TeamCity, a Jenkins server, it could be an Octopus server, like Ansible tower or something like that, but kind of narrowing the scope to what happens when an O-day is popped for like one of these things. And so obviously I'm talking about honeypots. So I just have like a little cliff notes of what honeypots are. And it's essentially something you chuck out there, which you're pretending to be legitimate, but often you're like opening it up to attacks. And that can be making it vulnerable intentionally. It can be not, and just like seeing what happens, waiting for those big O-days and stuff. But it's mainly there for you to like very thoroughly monitor it and get visibility over attacks. A really good thing of like explanation of what it is Lance started off, just open up a Linux server in like his living room to the internet, and he set it so that you could communicate in, but you couldn't communicate out. And you know, eventually at some point someone jumped in and they were just RFing all this stuff, and he got really excited. So when we're talking about honeypots, I'm very adamant to talk about levels of interaction, because when you say the term honeypot, it means so many different things, so many different people, and you know, projects can be stopped before they're even started because of this level of miscommunication. So the level of interaction you have of like, you have base level low interaction, and if you know anything on the internet, you're opening a port, you're listening on that port, and it's basically going down to the point of, did someone try to connect to this thing? And that can be very useful if you put it like inside of your network, somewhere where someone maybe shouldn't be poking and prodding around, and then sending off alerts. Or sometimes you scatter them all across the net and say who's being bad and poking and prodding a bunch of things they shouldn't be. And you slowly step up into medium interaction honeypots. So the thing we did on Tuesday for some of the people that did the workshop, we did a SSH-based honeypot, and it's not running a full shell, it's running like a pretend bash environment where someone can get in and do stuff, and you can actually see what they're doing and let them execute a bit of their stuff. And essentially we get to this point of, I split it into two different ways of public and private. So talking about private, going through that low interaction, and you can think of like where that high interaction would finally get to is just running a server, like not doing this intentionally vulnerable or any of this stuff. It's just like a full prod server. And as you can imagine, something that's very low interaction, so looking for port scanning. And if it's private on your private network, very easy to action that alert. Like someone is port scanning, doing something nasty inside of your network, that's very easy to action. And the ease of implementation obviously gets a bit more complicated as the honeypot gets more and more complicated. And the ease of action does get a little bit more muddy, because whenever you have more information, it's more things to sift through. And then as well, at the same time, when you jump over to the public, even if you're running this like cool, SSH level of interaction honeypot, someone jumps in, runs a bunch of malware, what do you do about that? I'm not saying there's nothing, but it's not as easy as someone's inside of your private network. And yeah, talking about carry, the SSH honeypot, you'll see a lot of stuff like this. It's like on a bunch of readmes for honeypots. They don't really want to take responsibility for saying this thing is secure. It's really down to your implementation, because ultimately you're letting bad people get in and do stuff. So this comes back to the exercise. So I wanted to build a fake company. I've always wanted to do it for a long time. And this is the kind of stuff I was thinking about. So I wanted it to be identifiable as a company and not just a random server sitting out there on the internet. So it had to have multiple moving parts, like a public front-end web presence, and something that would try to mimic my threat model at work. So something which was an Australian business on the internet. So if, say someone's attacking them, it's pretty similar to the kind of people that'll be attacking me. And then essentially the whole thing of cost effectiveness, because again, it's an experiment. So I just went around and messed with a bunch of stuff. But if I am to actually go through and follow this through again, what was worth it, what wasn't worth it? So running up something like this, I messed around with a few different ways of setting this up, but ultimately the easiest way was the easiest way, which is just running up a server documented process. So going off this example, I ran up a TeamCity server. I wanted to make it actually do something, so I set up a few builds in there so it doesn't look like just some empty server. In order for it to actually be a useful honeypot, I had to ship logs, and I've explicitly said ship logs and flow logs because ship logs, I mean sending application logs off the host, but then also flow logs to see what kind of network traffic this thing is doing. Obviously back up everything. Assume whenever you're deploying a honeypot that it will be compromised, but not in the good way, in the breakout way. Sprinkle honey tokens, which is just a bit of fun. Drop in AWS creds, see if anyone ever tries to use them and alert based off that. I did mess around with a while. I really wanted to have a transparent HTTP proxy so I could see all the traffic going outwards. And I did look at trying to put in an explicit proxy, but I really wanted malware to just run. And a transparent, explicit proxy wasn't really letting me do that. And then the transparent proxy, TeamCity got very angry at. And messing around with certificate trust for a whole afternoon, I essentially just spit the dummy and said, I'm just going with flow logs. Memory dumps. I was running all this in Docker. If you run Docker in experimental mode, you can get memory dumps out of it. They say don't do that in prod, but it's a very easy way of getting memory dumps of a container. So that was there. I didn't have to use it in anger, so I can't really comment on how useful that is. But I think whenever in doubt, always have information available. So circling back to the goal, obviously I'm generating a bunch of data at this point, but you do want to circle it back to hopefully something actionable. I like to talk about, IOCs, but I'm not going to tackle the whole threat intelligence thing because it's so many different types of data that makes up intelligence. But obviously, if we could get something out like a file hash, IP, domain, URL, from something that's maliciously running on there, that's very easy to action. It'd be really cool if I could get some TTPs, like if I'm running TeamCity over there as a honeypot and TeamCity over here in production, and they look identical, I would love to see what they've come through and do over on this server, because then I can check to see if the same thing has happened over here. And especially because why this is useful to run on a different server and not, say, like a production or a sample server or anything like that, is devs are messy and noisy. And I think anyone can attest to how annoying it is when you're trying to respond to an incident and you go through and you're like, oh, that's definitely malicious. Like, who the hell would ever do that? And you're like, oh, it's the devs. And so this is where I'm kind of going into the concept of a honeynet. It's exactly what you think it is. It's multiple honeypots in a network. I'm kind of doing it less in the traditional sense. Traditional sense might be you set up one type of honeypot and distribute it across several different networks. And that's where you get those really cool stuff like the map of the world with like the angry countries and the angry colors, and then the good countries and the soft blues. This is more just trying to run like a complex environment with multiple things in there, and then aggregate all that information in one spot. So what I was messing around with was having a team city doing builds. Obviously, I am interested in my own product because I would love to find out what bad people would do if they got a hold of it. So I jammed that in there. And also for like a front-end interface, like if you want to have a business, you have to have a front-end website. I chose WordPress because I really wanted to, like I would love to have someone get into there, and I had a lot of sprinkled things around to say, please move laterally. Spoiler, I never got anyone to move laterally from WordPress. But I chose WordPress because it's very enticing to script kiddies, stuff like that. You know, Eric Pinkerton, well-known script kiddie. So essentially, this gets into the point of incident response in a complex environment. And it's sounding awfully a lot like my day job. And the whole second point I had was cost effectiveness. In terms of setting up stuff like central logging, file system snapshots, memory dumps, that was all very easy. In terms of how I would respond to that in a production environment, you have to take into account so many things, like has there been data breaches? Has there been like a data integrity issue? You know, has this affected my availability? But when it's a fake business, I don't care because there is no customer data. I can tear down the whole thing and bring it back up in a second from my snapshots, and no one is going to whinge to me if the server's down for a while. So that was my way of reining it in. I hate this slide because it represents so much work for so little that goes into a presentation. Creating a social media presence sucks. And yeah, thank you. I spent a lot of time trying to set up fake people with a fake front end, Twitters, stuff like that. And I did it in a way where I had set up the whole environment, logging everything, and I wanted to stagger anything that I did. So what happens when you create a business page on Facebook? Can you measure that in the logs? And I think the answer is you need more followers to be able to see that measurement. And I don't think buying a bunch of fake followers is something that I morally want to do, or would be people that would click on my links. So ultimately what I circled back to this is I don't think without a huge significant investment, creating a fake social media presence is viable. But one thing I did do was general activity. So going back to like that WordPress website and the Team City server, I did try to make it look like it's a real thing. You set up a fake web hosting company and it's like, hey, we're secure. We use this Team City to build all of our servers. This is some of the fun stuff that I was messing around with. It was kind of therapeutic to write all of the things that you think are just horrible practices and create it as a business. Again, here's a hyperlink to our Team City server. And so kind of on the note of all of this stuff, one thing that I did have the most fun messing around with is, if you're familiar with the concept of Opsac, I don't know if this is a coined term or not, but the most fun for me was messing around with Opsac, which is basically the polar opposite of operational security. So I was trying to take anything that would lead to something bad normally in a business and just faceplant into it directly myself. And it was great because you had the whole environment and you could measure what would happen afterwards. My opinions are my own. I think Payspin could do a better job at trying to stop malicious activity, is all I will say. But doing, I simply started with just chucking the website on Payspin. And that was immediately, you could measure and see who's scraping Payspin, who's visiting my site, like the second it goes up there. Shodan, obviously anything I put up there, I'm not blocking any public scanners and stuff like that. I very much wanted everything I have to be searchable, Google, Shodan, anything you could do to find my environment. Because the idea is, O-Day pops, everyone goes, I'm going to look for all of these servers running this thing, I'm going to go hit that. Just chucking it in URL scan, just anything I could think of. The cred dumps was unfortunately a little bit lackluster, where you create a fake cred dump and you have a login page for your business and you dump a bunch of fake creds and you kind of expect someone to at least try one of them. In all this time, no one has tried my fake creds, so maybe they'll come out in collection 6 or whatever, which will be the next one. It might be sitting in someone's back pocket. I surely hope no one paid very much for it. Just a bit of like fun stuff of posting like an About Us URL to Payspin, just while we're on it, is seeing some of the requests that come through straight after you do that. One of the weirdest ones to me is like the Slackbot link expanding user agent. So obviously, this URL that I've posted to Payspin in less than a minute has ended up in someone's Slack channel. And for all I know, that person may be here that's in that Slack channel, but you're playing a dangerous game and sending everything. Unless it's someone manually reviewing and they're like, what's this? I'm gonna post this to my friend in Slack as a joke in less than a minute. I don't think so. So I think it's something automated, and I would love to find out whoever's doing that. But just obviously weird stuff. People mess around with Python requests libraries. They're obviously doing some scraping. Kind of at the same time, you have like another business here that's doing like some threat intelligence stuff. Kind of look them up. And obviously they're looking for like sensitive information that's being leaked. And then I think this is where I start to run into some noise. If you start to run into people looking for publicly known vulnerabilities and stuff like that. I have no radio.txt. Just getting random HTTP posts, obviously full of malicious payloads. And then just trying to get random environments. So I would definitely classify the last 3 here as just random scanning, but just in that short moment right when I went to Payspin, I had those immediate hits. And it was actually less than I was expecting. And then obviously, anything you put out there is going to show up in Shodan, and it's a good thing. So this is where I circle back to some of the stuff of how would it be best to run a complex honeypot like this. So ultimately, I have a server running just like any other production server. It raises this question of, should I even update this server if I want it to run as a honeypot? And it's an interesting question, and I guess it ultimately ties back to what are you trying to get out of it. For me, I'm an incident responder. I want to get incident response information out of it. So I want the version to be exactly the same as what I am running in production. I did try dialing back the version. In retrospect, I should have run an old version for a few weeks first and then upgraded, but I did it in the reverse order. But I noticed no different in scanning after I changed the version. I was really hoping for that to be the new hot thing, drop in Team City in like the 6 or so months I was running this through, but it was pretty much BAU. The other thing is whether or not to run an antivirus on something like this. You may immediately say, no, don't run an AV, but an AV might be a really good way to get alerting and to measure how is this going to happen in this environment compared to my actual production environment. But then at the same time, you do want to let them get as far as they can to find out ultimately their end goal. So I did lean on the direction of like, no AV, we want to see if bad stuff happens. This is kind of like a thing, I was running Sumo Logic for all of the log aggregation. And it was just kind of like an example of a very clean server without any of those pesky developers. With a, with a scheduled build, you can very easily set up a prediction of log events. Like I'm not counting specific metrics or anything like that, just number of log lines. It's very, very predictable, and you can tighten it way tighter than what you ever would in production and say, if this does something which it doesn't normally do, send me an alert. And I have this massive list of IPs that have gone through scanning this thing. These ones aren't necessarily scanners, but it's interesting going through. These are the private IPs on the right. The 153 is the TeamCity server, and the 239 is the WordPress server. These public IPs for these servers were generally in the same range. They were hosted in AWS, so lots of people are always poking and prodding AWS IPs. And just kind of sorting it by source IP, I was expecting a way more of like this server, like this random remote IP hit both of my servers. But generally across like the whole thing, it was about this where I only have one in line 6 and 7, it's the same IP that's hit both servers. And it was a really interesting data to pivot from, because you would say, you know, if this has hit a bunch of times, so like the number in the far column is just like a count. So how many HTTP requests has smashed against my server? So obviously line 6 and 7, it's probably a scanner because it's hit both servers a bunch of times. And every now and then you'll get 1 or 2 hits here on just one server. But what was really interesting to me was when you have just one server and get smashed a whole bunch of times, but nothing on the other. And I think that is down to maybe some of the complex environments for people that are running scanners out there. Yeah, I was trying to essentially pick out to see if there were like targeted scans, maybe pivoting from Shodan or something like that. Some of the other just like fun things is when you're trolling through all these request logs, looking for those scanners, you find a lot of stuff which isn't intended for your application. So obviously TeamCity is having this Java dummy spit about this HTTP request, and you kind of look through it, index.php. TeamCity isn't in PHP, so we definitely know it's not for us. Looking through, there's some keywords in there, like, you know, hello think PHP kind of gives it away. You can take that out, start looking for that, very quickly find that there was like a vulnerability in this framework, which is a quite popular Chinese framework apparently. And people are going ham scanning for this thing, I will say. So hopefully no one's running this, or if you are, it's patched. So kind of circling back of the experiment, what did I get out of it? One of the things I wanted to do at the start was make it identifiable as a company. And this was like, it's a very hard metric to measure if you're effective on this or not. In like the 6 months that it's ran, it hasn't had any like major, you know, breaches or anything like that. But in terms of just having like a public web page with like a contact us page and stuff like that, you can pretty quickly look at that and go, that looks like a company. In terms of trying to set up a social media presence, it's a lot of effort, and it's not going to get very far unless you want to become like a marketing person in your side gig for zero payoff. Multiple moving parts was super high effort. Having like TeamCity, other servers in there, like WordPress, it ended up being quite a lot to look at. Like having those multiple public IPs is a great pivoting point, but if I would go back and do this again, I would potentially maybe just take something like the TeamCity server and run a bunch of them instead of running a bunch of different things. In terms of trying to copy what my threat model is, I kind of put this down as low effort as long as I kept this scope of, my initial kickoff was log4j happened, we run TeamCity, I'm scared. And part of it in the back of my brain is what I'm actually saying when I run that is, I'm running at a company servicing a product, and we also have a big SaaS platform, which is, it's no secret that it's written in .NET. And if the same thing happens in the .NET world, I would love to be in a much better position than the people having to respond to log4j. So essentially scoping it down to what are your crown jewels was quite effective, I think. So the overall cost effectiveness, as long as you did those things, it would be low effort, but it is a complete rabbit hole that you can just dive down. One of the things I was super happy with was that strict activity alerting. One thing that I had chatted with Ramiz quite a lot about was how do we alert? Because essentially, I'm trying to run like a full production server, and I want to say, when has it been breached? And if I have that answer, surely every single incident responder would want that magic silver bullet answer. And the silver bullet is just don't have any developers and you have no activity. It's very easy to find out when bad stuff happens. And just having a clean environment is a very useful tool in my experience. For the people that have had to respond to that situation where big vulnerabilities come out, it's in the wild, you have that oh no moment, and obviously they're probing your public stuff. But then maybe you have a WAF or maybe you have an AV and you go, I don't think we're affected, but it's gonna take me a long time to do that investigation. But having that like clean environment over on the side gives you like a great comparison point without all of the extra noise of everyday work. So targeted attacks, unfortunately, I'd never got specific targeted TeamCity attacks. I had my fingers crossed for a new CV to drop, but it didn't arrive and I had to end it eventually. Attacks did not change when the version changed. Did WordPress get targeted? Yes. But I'll say, I dropped WordPress, and yes, you see WordPress scanning. But after a certain amount of time, it did increase of the specific WordPress scanning. So does that mean that people are going out specifically targeting TeamCity? Probably not. Maybe they're waiting to get to one on a private network, but by God, they're hammering WordPress. So yeah, that basically brings it around to the end. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, we do actually have a question. You're getting feedback before they shut you down here. And I thought I was going to have to read out the questions you gave me, but I couldn't read your typing. So there's a question from Clinton. It says, did you consider making a breach disclosure for your fake company in line with other people's talks?
I didn't consider that. I think that's a really cool idea, but at the same time, that does come back to all of the social media aspect of it was the most draining. And this was like a personal project, and there's nothing worse than spending your personal time on Facebook and Twitter. And it was just, it was a lot to go through. And I didn't want to potentially end up into like some spicy waters where I have like the government contacting me saying, was your business breached? And I'm like, what business?
Cool. So I think you mentioned AWS. Did you look at other places to host your Honey company?
No, just AWS.
Okay, cool. Of course. And what about host telemetry? Did you look at actual telemetry from the host?
Yeah, that was also a really good metric. And again, that was the kind of thing where I did mess around with tuning that very specifically. The CPU was very noticeably, spiked when I needed it to spike and didn't spike when it didn't. So it's something that I was also looking at alerting on.
There's some funny questions here. Yeah, so Jamie's asked a question, and it said, is there anything you didn't do because of time constraints? Maybe.
I would say one of the pipe dreams I wanted to mess around with was memory analysis. So like doing memory dumps. When you have like a cron just dumping memory on a server, which is like a clean environment, you should in theory be able to try to look at like differences out there, like if you're pulling strings out, what's in there today that wasn't in there yesterday, and then you also have a comparison point maybe of like another server. I would have loved to have had something like that automated doing memory analysis for me.
Cool. And did you think about sharing what you're doing with Team City themselves? Maybe to help them out?
If I found something, I would, yeah.
Cool. Well, everyone, if you'd like to thank me again, thank Colby again. And I've got a little gift, Colby. It's some special gin brewed in, with flowers from fresh from above. Awesome, man. Thanks.
Thanks.